Okay, thanks for joining us for our conversation with Kathleen Enright, who has been president and chief executive officer of the Council on Foundations since 2019. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Kathleen.
No.
Before which she was president and CEO of Grant Makers for Effective Organizations. Joining me in the questioning, I'm going to say doing most of the questioning, is Craig Kennedy, who is a regular contributor to the Giving Review, which we very much appreciate. And he is a past president of both the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Joyce Foundation in Chicago. Craig, did you want to start us off then?
Well, you know, the genesis of this conversation, Kathleen, was when you and I spoke, and I was really struck by how thoughtful and insightful you were about the current political, environment for the charitable sector and especially for foundations. We're at this funny point where you see criticism from the left, Institute for Policy Studies, the famous Voulet, and from the right of how philanthropy operates. What do you make of it? Is it serious? Is it something you should be listening to? And you can say that even though I'd be part of it, are they just a bunch of fringe kooks that are really not serious about their criticisms?
Oh, I think that the only way that we get better in complex work is by listening to a variety of voices, including our critics. But overall, you mentioned, Craig, that philanthropy is being kind of pulled in a variety of directions from both the left and the right. And, it just strikes me that we're affected by the same forces impacting the rest of society. The rise of populism is then intensifying all kinds of suspicions of the motives of the wealthy, or, a general distrust in institutions of all kinds. And then polarization, it's driving us to remain in our silos, to distrust and even dehumanize folks that think differently than us, to retreat into ideological bunkers. And all of that increases the gaps between folks who potentially need to work together in common cause. And it makes us in like a high conflict environment that, ends up in sort of a destructive cycle that there are no winners in this cycle. So, when we see the pushes and the pulls from both sides, our hope is that we can find a way through, a better path forward, where folks who are committed to the common good, even though they might see the approach to getting there very differently, are willing to at least hear each other out and learn from each other and listen deeply as they move their work.
Well, we really appreciate that attitude, and we'll try to proceed today in that same vein. There's really three areas that I think are especially interesting in terms of where the criticism has come from. One is really the distribution requirement, and you hear this much more on the left. When the 5% figure was set, it was at a time when literally foundations had their money in bonds or stocks. There was maybe a little bit of venture capital. There certainly weren't hedge funds or all of the complicated investments now that have really allowed endowments in general, not just foundations, to make pretty substantial gains over the last 30 years. Do you think it's a legitimate issue to ask that maybe the distribution requirement be raised?
Of course, it's a legitimate thing to look at. The one thing that the council would always be in support of is that some foundations are able to exist in perpetuity. One of the real strengths of philanthropy is, as an ecosystem, it itself is diverse. There are donors and vehicles that can give quickly, and in the short term, there are those who decide that they want to spend down, and there are those who are able to look and take the very long view on some challenges that are intractable and have been around for generations, and therefore likely need attention over generations in order to make progress on them.
So the answer is you wouldn't want to see a distribution of a requirement raised that would endanger the ability of foundations to sustain themselves. But is that number 5%?
I don't know. I will say out loud that we are looking at it. We're looking at the issue. That is not anything that Congress is, coming to right this minute. But, we are certainly in conversation with our members. We're looking at the numbers to see where that space really is.
Okay. So the next area, and I know it's one that maybe you've questioned my own views on it, but I'm going to raise it anyway, is donor advised funds.
Oh, I appreciate the dissenting opinion, and that might be mine in this room, but I very much like the conversation.
Well, so I think there's two sets of issues there that can trouble people, especially in the context of foundations. One is the use of donor advised funds to meet the distribution requirement. And there certainly is, I think you remember this investigative piece that ran in Bloomberg, 6 months ago, of 5 or 6, significant new foundations where most of their distribution requirement was going into DAFs. And then the second is the use of DAFs, I don't know, to make to provide a cloak of secrecy on where money is going. And I think we both know that there are foundations that use it that way. Most of them would say, well, not really, or whatever. But it certainly is evident that some significant foundations do use DAFs to avoid public scrutiny of where they're putting the money. So on the first one, do you have an opinion of whether this is good or not? Should foundations be able to use DAFs to meet their distribution requirement?
Absolutely not. I mean, of course, we don't think that people should be skirting their requirement as a 501c3 PF by giving to a donor advised fund. Where you and I might differ, Craig, or where the council's view might differ from what is actually in the president's budget recommendation, is that we think that a couple years, there should be a couple years of wiggle room in there, because there are really valid, appropriate reasons that private foundations give to donor advised funds. A capital project that gets delayed, there's a whole host of things that might happen where they want to put the money aside in this budgetary year, but then it's not going to go out for a little bit. There's also lots of collaborative reasons why this might happen. So absolutely, it should not be included in payout unless it goes out in a pretty swift fashion. But same year, we would probably say 2 to 3 years, something like that. Similarly, your second thing was the lack of transparency. I guess I'll just to close that one out.
Okay.
We would absolutely be in favor of figuring out how to tighten up the regulations around private foundation use of donor advised funds. In how it applies to payout. But what we wouldn't be interested in is for that channel to be closed off entirely. Donor advised funds are a collaborative device. They're used for a variety of legitimate, appropriate reasons by private foundations, and those should still be able to, they should be able to avail themselves of those.
Okay. And what about the privacy issue?
Well, actually, you brought up the Bloomberg thing, and I want to talk about that too. I mean, things like that just need to be closed down, right? Like if anyone is giving their entire annual payout to a donor advised fund, and it is not a conversion. So you all both know that sometimes, individuals have a private foundation, it's small, they don't have any staff, and they decide to convert it to a donor advised fund. And so when that happens, they're giving big chunks of their money, probably more than their whole payout in 3 or 4 years as they go through that conversion. I think that has kind of made the numbers look a little goofy in some of the analysis that people do. Because community foundations, they market that because they can staff the donor advised fund more efficiently than, having a private foundation going through all of the accounting and, reporting requirements that they have. So if that is not what's happening, and then that is a loophole that needs to be closed.
Okay. And so using DAFs to avoid public scrutiny, to make, I don't know, controversial grants or grants that you don't want associated with your institution, is that a legitimate use of DAFs?
I mean, this is a hard one, because when we just talked about pooled funding, right? So DAFs are sometimes set up for a collaborative giving device. And so the thing that I can't track actually is how all of those circumstances could be tracked back to the original donor. Many private foundations decide to list, this is the additional set of grants that were given out of the Bluegrass Community Foundation, which is where we hold our donor advised fund on X, Y, or Z. But one great example of this isn't about avoiding the trackability, but the Knight Foundation has donor advised funds in all of their Knight communities, and so that is how they do their grant making. They want the money to be housed in the community that they're attempting to serve. And so, so that they have, I don't know what it is, 15 Knight communities. I can't remember what the number is.
Something like that.
A side goal for them is to build up the community foundation, to enable the community foundation to be stronger. So that again, I don't think all of those grants that are made out of there are reported by Knight. I'm not positive. We need to figure that out. But their intent is very much a field building and localization intent, to have the money live where it's going to be given out. Yeah.
Would there be any good reason why the same rules that apply to foundations shouldn't be applied to donor advised funds in terms
if you
of
talk about
it?
And I mean, so it's the complex. Sorry, Craig, I'm interrupting you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. But I think a simple, in 1969, I believe there was something like less than $100 million in DAFs, something like that. It was a very small number. By far, the largest endowment in the country was Ford at that time, which was almost $3 billion. Just to show how things have changed, Harvard at that time had less than $1 billion in its endowment. And today, everything is reversed. The DAFs have taken off. Somehow I have a feeling that if you had those same people discussing the rules of charity today, they would say, well, DAFs are fine, but they should play by the same rules as foundations. Is there any reason not to think about it that way?
Well, it depends on which rules you're talking about. I mean, donor advised funds are housed in public charities, and so they have broader discretion because, for a variety of reasons, but they meet the public support test. So they are aggregators, right? So for a variety of reasons, I don't think that they should necessarily play by all the same rules, but some of them, and I think that they already are. I think, Craig, when you and I spoke last time, we talked about the 5% payout for donor advised funds. When we did our listening session with our members, and we had a group that informed some policies that we would very much support if we got down to that in legislation, and one of them was at least a 5% payout rate on an institution level for donor advised funds. The complexity comes in when you talk about the thousands, tens of thousands of donor advised funds that many of these donor advised fund organizations have, and doing that on a account by account basis would be debilitating in a lot of respects, especially for community foundations. So doing it at the meta level, absolutely. They're already giving out, way more than the 5% minimum.
But in this day of very sophisticated computer programs, I mean, Fidelity has what, 1.5 billion accounts that they provide statements for all the time on a monthly basis. Surely community foundations would be able to handle that kind of that kind of challenge, wouldn't they?
That is not what our members report to us. That they suggested it would be incredibly difficult to manage that kind of new requirement. Additionally, I was trying to think. Oh yeah, in both cases, they have tightened up their funds activity policies, right? So we have Community Foundation National Standards, where 400 plus community foundations are accredited through that, and you have to have a funds activity policy. And what we're pushing for is a funds activity policy with more teeth, like some of the national providers do, which is they do a sweep. If you haven't given in 3 years, you get notified, and then some amount gets swept into the previous couple nonprofits that you gave to. That sounds like a terrific solution, and that's something that can be automated. So I think 5% overall, 5% at each little account also kind of makes it hard for folks to do some of the planning that they might be doing. For instance, someone gets a big bonus 2 years in a row, but they know that in a couple of years they're going to be retired, and they want to maintain their level of charitable giving. So they put that full bonus in, for several years, but that large amount doesn't go out because they're kind of at a basis, at a basic level, and right. Because they keep doing that for 15 years, So, I mean, these are all reasonable, good reasons to want to do this. And I'll tell you, Craig, you maybe I said this when we were talking privately. When I first got this job, I had a lot of questions about donor advised funds, and I had some, wonders myself whether they were operating as they should. And the more that I dug in, and the more I looked at the things that that folks were kind of calling out to be suspicious, the more confident I became in them as a vehicle, because they are, they're more efficient a lot of times than private foundations. They're more flexible. They have more checks and balances in place against things like self-dealing. You certainly aren't going to pay the trustees, who are also family members, exorbitant compensation with anything to do with a donor advised fund. So I think a lot of the things that have been concerns by previous critics get eliminated through donor advised funds.